Welcome to Echoes of the Unknown, the podcast where we explore some of the world's most fascinating unsolved mysteries. I'm Jack Montgomery, and today we're traveling to Las Cruces, New Mexico, where an ordinary day in 1990 at a bowling alley turned into one of the most horrifying unsolved crimes in U.S. history. For 4 terrifying hours, employees and children were held captive inside, while armed attackers carried out a brutal robbery that spiraled into torture, execution, and fire. Despite surviving witnesses and countless leads, the killers remain unknown. It was a quiet Saturday morning on February 10, 1990, and Las Cruces Bowl was preparing to open for the day. The popular neighborhood bowling alley stood at 1201 East Amador Avenue in Las Cruces, a desert city near the borders of Texas and Mexico. To local families, it was not a place associated with fear. It was a familiar weekend gathering spot, the kind of place where children played arcade games, parents brought them for birthday parties, and regulars knew the faces behind the counter. On Saturday mornings, the bowling alley also offered childcare, which made it a convenient place for working parents and employees with children in tow. Inside the building that morning was 34-year-old Stephanie Senek, the bowling alley's manager. Her 12-year-old daughter Melissa was there with her, along with Melissa's 13-year-old friend Amy Hauser. The 2 girls were planning to help supervise the bowling alley's daycare. Also inside was 33-year-old Ida Holgan, who worked at Las Cruces Bowl as a cook. At approximately 8:20 that morning, 2 armed men entered Las Cruces Bowl through an unlocked door. The suspects were later described as Hispanic men with dark complexions. Investigators believed both spoke fluent English, and at least one account suggested one of them may also have spoken Spanish. One of the men encountered Ida in the kitchen, and he forced her to go into the manager's office, where Stephanie, Melissa, and Amy were already being held. Sometime later, 26-year-old Stephen Tarrin, the bowling alley's pin mechanic, arrived with his 2 young daughters, 6-year-old Paula and 2-year-old Valerie. Stephen had been unable to find a babysitter, and his plan was to leave the girls at the bowling alley's daycare before beginning his shift. He had no reason to know that a robbery was underway. When he did not see anyone in the public area of the bowling alley, he went toward the office and stumbled directly into the crime in progress. At that moment, he and the 2 little girls became hostages too. There were now 7 victims inside the small room, along with the 2 armed men. The gunmen demanded access to money from the business, and they ended up taking cash and checks from the bowling alley safe. The amount stolen was not enormous. Investigators later believed it was less than $5,000. That detail has haunted the case for decades, because the brutality that followed seemed wildly disproportionate to the robbery itself. As the morning dragged on, the robbers' behavior became even more baffling and disturbing. At some point during the nearly 4-hour ordeal, the gunmen forced Stephen to accompany one of them to a second bowling alley that was owned by the Senek family, who operated Las Cruces Bowl. Investigators believe the gunmen took him there in a desperate search for more money, suggesting that the robbers may have known the family operated more than one bowling business. Yet whatever they expected to find was not there. No additional cash was obtained, and authorities have never publicly explained exactly why the effort failed. Stephen was then brought back to Las Cruces Bowl, where he remained a captive alongside the others. What happened inside the office during the next few hours that morning remains only partially understood. However, investigators determined that several victims suffered severe blunt force injuries before the shootings began. The gunmen repeatedly struck hostages with their .22 caliber handgun and subjected them to hours of fear, threats, and intimidation. While the full extent of the abuse may never be known, many observers have concluded that the captives endured a prolonged and terrifying ordeal that amounted to torture before the final gunshots were fired. At approximately 12:10 p.m., after holding their victims captive for nearly 4 hours, the attackers opened fire at close range. All 7 victims were shot execution style, including 2-year-old Valerie, and several of them were struck multiple times. The violence was methodical and devastating. After the shooting, the gunmen set fire to the office, apparently in an effort to destroy evidence. They then fled the scene. Shortly thereafter, 12-year-old Melissa managed to call 911, despite suffering multiple gunshot wounds. That call was crucial. It brought police and firefighters to the bowling alley quickly and almost certainly saved lives. When first responders arrived, they found a scene of smoke, fire, blood, and unimaginable human suffering. 3 victims were already dead when officers arrived: Stephen, Paula, and Amy. Valerie was rushed to a local hospital but died shortly after arrival. Stephanie, Melissa, and Ida survived the initial attack and were transported for medical treatment. However, Stephanie never fully recovered from her injuries, and she died in 1999 from complications connected to the shooting. In total, 5 victims ultimately died and 2 survived. The survivors became essential to the investigation. Melissa, who had shown extraordinary presence of mind in calling 911 while gravely wounded, helped provide information about the attackers. Ida also contributed to what investigators were able to learn. Composite sketches were created and released, giving the public images of the 2 men police believed were responsible. From the very beginning, investigators faced a troubling question. Why had the attackers used such extreme violence? The robbery itself did not appear to involve a life-changing amount of money. The victims included children. The gunmen had already taken what they came for. Yet they still shot every person in the office and set the room on fire before leaving. That combination of robbery, execution-style shooting, and arson led detectives to wonder whether there was more to the crime than a simple theft. The Las Cruces Police Department, the FBI, and other agencies pursued the case. Roadblocks were set up around the city in the immediate aftermath. Authorities searched for the 2 men who they thought may have fled the area, possibly toward Mexico. Tips came in, leads were followed, suspects were considered, but the case did not break open. Over the years, theories multiplied. Some investigators wondered whether the killers had expected more money to be inside the bowling alley. Others questioned whether one or both men had some prior familiarity with Las Cruces Bowl, its layout, or its routines. Some considered whether the crime might have had a personal motive or whether the robbery was meant to conceal something else. However, none of those possibilities produced enough evidence for arrests. The case remained especially painful because it was not a mystery without witnesses. After all, survivors had seen the attackers. The killers had moved through the building in daylight. They had interacted with their victims. They had left behind descriptions detailed enough for composite sketches. And yet somehow they were both able to vanish. For the families involved, the years that followed brought grief without closure. Stephen had gone to work that morning with his daughters because he had no childcare available, and Paula and Valerie were not supposed to be in any danger. Amy had simply come to spend time with her friend and to help at the daycare. Stephanie and Ida were simply doing their jobs. Melissa was a child who survived something no child should ever have to witness. The horror of the Las Cruces bowling alley massacre lies partly in its setting. This was not a remote road, an abandoned building, or a hidden crime scene discovered days later. It happened in a public place that was normally associated with family life, laughter, and ordinary weekend routines. The victims were people who expected nothing more than another Saturday morning at work. As the years passed, the bowling alley itself became inseparable from the crime. The name Las Cruces Bowl came to represent not just a business, but a wound in the city's memory. For many residents, the massacre marked the moment when a familiar place of recreation became a symbol of vulnerability and fear. The case has periodically returned to public attention through anniversaries, news reports, documentaries, and renewed investigative efforts. Even today, authorities refuse to give up hope. A reward of $25,000 remains available for information leading to the identification of the two men believed to be responsible for the massacre. Investigators continue to emphasize that loyalties change, relationships change, and people who were once afraid to speak may no longer have the same reasons to remain silent. Someone, somewhere, may still hold the key to solving one of America's most disturbing, unsolved mass murders. That possibility, that someone still knows the truth, may be the most haunting part of all. Somewhere there may be a person who remembers two men acting strangely that morning. Someone who heard a confession, someone who noticed unexplained money, someone who recognized a police sketch yet chose to remain silent, someone who has carried a secret for more than 3 decades. Cold cases sometimes turn on the smallest surviving detail, a preserved piece of evidence, a witness who finally speaks, a family member who comes forward after years of fear. Advances in forensic science have solved cases that were once thought to be hopeless, and investigators have continued to express hope that the Las Cruces case may still be solved. For nearly 4 long and terrifying hours, 7 innocent people endured fear that is difficult to imagine. 5 of them never came home. 2 survived with physical and emotional scars that would last a lifetime. And somewhere beyond the composite sketches, the unanswered questions, in the passage of more than 3 decades, 2 men walked away from Las Cruces Bowl and vanished into history, leaving behind a mystery that a grieving community has never been able to forget. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Echoes of the Unknown. If you found this story compelling, please don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share with fellow mystery lovers. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, sometimes the most terrifying mysteries are the ones that unfold in ordinary places, where evil appears without warning and then vanishes without a trace.